Okay, the French Yellow Vest protests have now hit their fifth week. What started out as a protest against a planned raise in diesel tax and diesel prices by the French government has now turned into much wider protests against the French government. They're protesting on living standards. They're protesting on workers' rights. They're protesting on the tax rises that unfairly affect rural and small towns in France. They're protesting against the Parisian elite, and there's a bit of a protest against the EU because the right and left wings in France are very known to be very anti-European Union, and the centrist parties have governed France since 1945. Uh, it's basically spread from Paris to many major cities in France. It's even spread as far as Brussels in Belgium. There's been yellow vest protests there, and yes, the protests have turned violent and caused vast sums of damage. And it's been compared to the 1968 student uprising in France, which was of a similar scale of disorder. So 50 years ago, almost to the day, the French students decided enough's enough. They had a bit of a riot, and this has been compared to that. So go into your history books, kids, and look up the 1968 student uprising in France, and look at the news and video footage. This happened at a time of the Vietnam War. There was big social unrest in Europe and in North America, in the West. So far in this protest movement, because the French love a good riot, there's been 8 deaths and hundreds of injuries. It it it's I would compare it to the 2011 London riots that spread around the UK in the summer of 2011. I would compare it on a similar level of disorder to that, except the length of time it's been going on now is astonishing. They're into their fifth week. While the protests and the riots are smaller in scale and at their peak, they're still doing it. There's no overall leadership. It's done by it's the social media age, so this has all been organised by social media. When the student protests happened, there was leadership from student bodies and trade unions. There is no leadership here. The right and left wing are backing the protesters because they are both anti-EU. The Front National is anti-EU, and the Communist Party is anti-EU, and have been from the beginning. And the far right party, the Front National, or the right wing. There are some far right elements of the second most popular party in France. They came second in the presidential election, and they've won a lot of regional elections. So there is a political undermining of the Macron government. Macron is more unpopular than Sarkozy and Hollande were in their very unpopular time in charge, and they were also reforming presidents. Yeah, people in France aren't ready for the reforms, and if there has to be a reform, it has to be done the right way. And I think the French government were going about it the wrong way. The Macron government were determined to force through this tax reform, but they've done a U-turn. They've realised these protesters aren't going to go away. There has to be some kind of coherent plan in order to change the structure of the fact that the French government has encouraged people, especially in rural areas, to buy diesel cars and diesel vans for the better part of 25 years. Has basically undermined this tax rise because 70% of vehicles in France are diesel now. And even the Macron government, until this year, were encouraging people to switch to diesel from petrol, even though petrol's more fuel efficient and actually less damaging to the environment. It's just insanity. Well, we were sold as Europeans this lie that diesel's better, and it's transpired with the emissions fixing scandal from Volkswagen that it's not. And the governments are looking very, very foolish. And it's basically meant that if you want to sell your car second hand, you won't get any money for it. And scrap dealers have basically been going as low as £3 for a car here in the UK. So in France, it's very, very similar. The scrap value of a diesel car is nil. They get overwhelmed with demand, and that actually pushes down the scrap value of metal because there's a surge on the market that they just can't process. The government had to U-turn on their tax policy, but even with the U-turn, the protests are still continuing. And it's getting, these protesters are angry. They're from every strata of society, every colour and creed. This isn't just a student middle class protest. This is working class up to the upper classes. Outside of Paris, they've descended upon Paris and Nice and Marseille and Bordeaux and Dijon and all these major regional cities in France because they feel that this tax rise benefits the Parisian elite and And of course, the big cities in France have very, very good metro systems, tram systems, and public transit systems that the rural and small towns outside of the metropolitan areas of France don't have. And there are some industrial areas of France that are very deprived right now, high unemployment. This is more than just a protest over fuel tax. This is a deeper issue within French society that I think has been going on for the last 10, 20 years. There's been a couple of recessions in France. The financial system, the financial crash, the insistence on the euro as a currency across Europe has not always benefited all. It's benefited Germany, basically. And yeah, another thing, because I have my sports channel, sport and public events have been cancelled. A lot of top-flight French football games have been cancelled, partly because football hooligans are a thing in Europe, and they're quite violent, and so the police can't guarantee the safety of mainstream spectators. And other public events, such as Christmas markets, have been reduced in size. So that's had an effect on the social life of France. But the fact that this movement has spread to Belgium, it shows no sign of going away anytime soon. Even with the weather being really nasty outside with rain and snow and sleet and strong winds, they're still protesting. And there seems to be no plan by the Yellow Vests to back down and give a Christmas truce. They plan to keep going. There's been no rhetoric from the Yellow Vests because there's no leadership. The French government doesn't seem to have a coherent long-term plan. They just, oh yeah, we'll cancel the tax rise for a year. That should make them go away. No. While the protests may be smaller on this fifth week than they were at their peak on the first, second, and third weeks, these people aren't going away. There is still a movement to protest, and the French system is heavily favoured in favour of the trade unions. The right to protest is a thing. Yeah, it is a big thing in France, and the French know how to turn a protest into a riot very, very quickly. The previous, I would say, two presidents before Macron had to deal with some really violent riots and protests in their presidency. Sarkozy, there was a similar thing to the London riots, where there were youth riots over police brutality from 2005 onwards, and they got pretty violent and distasteful. So President Hollande had some very militant protests against some of his reforms. Macron was actually a junior member of the Hollande government, so he's seen still part of the establishment, even though he started up a new party and won the election. He's not a very popular guy. There seems to be no end to these protests, yeah, 8 deaths so far. So the fact that the police or people have been killed doesn't help the French government's position. It actually adds further fuel to the fire that the far right and the left wing and the far left are fueling as well, saying that you got to keep the pressure up, keep the pressure up, keep the pressure up. And because there's been deaths and injuries are going to be unavoidable, but there's been fatalities, doesn't look good for the French security forces that are already seen as OTT and a bit brutal at times. And they fired rubber bullets, they fired tear gas, water cannon in the middle of winter. I mean, come on, that's going to cause hypothermia. Yeah, it's not a good situation. So we will keep updated with this Yellow Vest movement and see if these protests continue. I can't see an end to it. They may be getting smaller in size as we get closer to Christmas, but I wouldn't be surprised when the weather improves. This protest movement still continues. And I wouldn't be surprised if the government U-turns on their U-turn at some point when they think it's safe to do so. So there we go. The French Yellow Vest protests continue for a 5th week. Thank you very much for watching. If you have been out in France or even Belgium and seen these things, please comment on your views on the Yellow Vest movement. And has it been hijacked by the far right and the far left? And has the violence been done by Yellow Vest protesters or just general agitators for the far right and the far left? Also, what do you make of the deaths and the injuries and the damage? And, could this lead to Macron's government collapsing and fresh elections in France? Could there be some kind of constitutional changes made to the French constitution? Because they are comparing this to the 68 student uprising, and that led to the army on the streets firing bullets at protesters. So there we go. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, place your comments below, and I'll have some more videos on the history buffing for you soon.